Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us at the Popper Society. I'm pleased to announce that today we have as our guest Richard Bailey, who is a writer, researcher, and speaker currently located in Malaysia. He has written, I think, 30 books and more than 120 scientific articles on philosophy, evolutionary theory, sports science, and one book on lettuce in Japanese, which I thought was great. And he did his PhD in philosophy of education on the implications of Popper's epistemology for education, psychology, and politics. And a much adapted version of his thesis was published as the book Education and the Open Society, Karl Popper and Schooling. And as Richard told me, it seems that he had the last interview with Popper, and as he also told me, to the best of his knowledge, there's no causal relationship between that interview and his passing. But yeah, that was a great, I think we shared the article on Twitter before, when we announced the talk. And it was a really fascinating interview with Popper about his educational background, which is not much covered. As you kind of say in the interview, I think many people are kind of surprised to find that Popper actually had a background in education before he got into philosophy of science. And as I was surprised to learn, he actually kind of started thinking about these issues, and he wanted to write the logic of scientific discovery when an inspector, a school inspector, who he very much disliked, was an inductivist. So that was new for me. I didn't realize this at all, and fascinating background. And as we were saying just before we went online, there was actually a story there about the interview and how you met Popper at his house, which, yeah, it would be great if you could get into that.
Yeah, sure. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Thanks for coming along. Yes, that's right. So when I did a PhD thesis on Popper, I was a school teacher, and but years earlier I'd come across Popper's work. I left school at 16, and mainly to keep warm, I think. I was in the local library and stumbled across the Open Society and its enemies. So when I started to think about my PhD, I just think, well, education, Popper, that makes sense. So I wrote to Popper in Kenley, near Croydon, and he wrote back, and kind of really one of my prized possessions, talking about some of his early experiences and early ideas. So I wrote back again, rather cheekily, and then he wrote back again, and we had a little exchange of writing, and then he said in his final letter, "You must visit." So I thought, fantastic. He phoned him up, and he got the phone. The phone was answered by a lady called Melissa Mew, who was his personal assistant and was a rather terrifying Austrian lady, whose job primarily was to protect him, because of course he was a very old man when I met him, and it was coming to the end of his life. He was, not particularly robust, and I think her job, as far as she understood it, was to prevent him from doing anything that could tire him out. So we had a series of phone calls over about 3 weeks, most every day actually, over a period of 3 weeks, in which I would talk to him. And then over 3 weeks, I finally figured out what day Mrs. Mew had off, because she had to have a day off. And then on that day, I phoned up and said, "Can I come up now?" And he said, "Yes." So I got on the train and went to visit him. And I got to see him in his house. The grand piano, which he mentions, of course, in his autobiography, was there, and it was kind of pride of place. I think if you didn't know what he did, you would assume he was a musician, not a philosopher. But he had this apartment, all of the walls were covered with his books. And yes, and the interview was actually conducted in German, because I couldn't understand what he said in English. Obviously, he wrote in my opinion, beautiful English, among the very, very best English writing philosophers. But I simply couldn't understand what he was saying when he spoke English. So like my kind of faulty German, we did the interview, and that became the article. And then that contributed to the thesis and the development of the PhD idea. And yeah, it was a really, really interesting experience. You know, my kind of, it's strange how you remember odd things, but my abiding memory was I turned up 2 hours early for the interview, and then I thought, well, I can't just walk in early. So I waited on a private road for 2 hours until they called the police. Neighbours called the police. It looked like I was a criminal. So rather hurriedly, I went to his house and rang the doorbell. And his first word to me was, "You're 1 minute early." So that was the context of the interview. But yeah, I mean, he was without a doubt an extraordinary thinker, an extraordinary man. And if you remember in his autobiography, and when he talks about the open society and the poverty of historicism is his war effort, I did not get a sense that had diminished by the time he was in his quite old age. So yeah, it was kind of, they always say never meet your heroes, but mine was not at all unpleasant.
Sam, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I said that's fantastic. Yeah, and as I said, I really enjoyed the resulting interview.
Thank you.
And it was kind of fascinating seeing Popper write about education, because I think his philosophy has a lot of implications for how we teach and how we think about teaching. Yeah. And I was kind of surprised to see that Popper was in favor of some dogmatism. So he had various kind of, I would think, conflicting ideas about the topic. So one of them was that he, as he writes in his autobiography, that we should teach children about their interests. We shouldn't answer unasked questions, and we shouldn't bother them with questions that they haven't been asked. And yet he was also for some kind of dogmatism. He said there needs to be some kind of dogmatic approach to education until the age where they can really become critical and the student has the ability to answer critical questions. Do you think there's a kind of contradiction there? Do you think that that's just unintuitive, but it makes sense?
Well, I think there's a surface contradiction. I mean, we should also point out the age at which he says students should be able to think critically is postgraduate university. So it's not like that, if you read some of the books about education and Popper, most of the books, they have this kind of radical progressivism. And I think that is just to misunderstand what he said. I think it's possible, as you've said, to look at Popper when he talks about how people learn and to identify a constructivist type of approach where you've got the individual child making their way through life, through problem solving, which seems to me completely persuasive. And then that transfers to a constructivist pedagogy in which the teacher takes a step back. And that seems to be, well, certainly that's not the view that he had, I would say. As you said, he emphasized dogmatism quite strongly. And in the sense in the early stages, the way I interpret it in my book is what I call, I don't like the phrase now, but the criticalist curriculum. Like all Popperians, we have to use the word critical in every conceivable context. And the criticalist curriculum is that essentially initially dogmatic in the sense of there are certain fundamental skills, he would say, which are kind of non-arguable, like literacy and numeracy, certain social behavioral codes and things like that. But that gradually diminishes to the point where criticality takes over. And I think he would argue that you need something to criticize. Now, this is talking about pedagogy. I'm not talking about how children learn. And I think this is the error. So some writers about Popper and education say, more or less, if this is the way children learn, this is the way we should teach them. I think that is certainly contradicted by evidence. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that guided discovery and discovery learning are not effective ways of developing core basic skills. It's far more effective to tell them. I think it's also consistent, as people like Arne Peterson, one of Popper's research team showed, which is that even if you're teaching in a dogmatic way, the child is still reconstructing and problem solving and creating their own knowledge from that. So the pedagogy is simply a matter of efficiency. The way the child makes sense of the world is, I think, consistent with the idea of an active problem-solving creature. And I think if that's the case, then he isn't contradicting himself, because when we quote Popper on education, we mainly quote him talking about how children learn. Very rarely does he talk about how teachers should teach. And to conflate the two is actually to make quite a serious categorical error, I think. You know, they're two separate questions and should be treated as such. So, yeah.
Very nice. Yeah, I think I'm more of the, as you said, the progressive end of this. And I was actually hoping that we could have a discussion about that, because I think that there, as you said, usually Popperians have a tendency to be more on the kind of progressive side of this, to say that schooling is maybe not the most efficient way to teach, that children should be left to their own devices, that they should be supported, but they shouldn't have to go to classes and things.
Yeah.
And
right. Yeah.
I thought it would be fun to have a discussion about that. I think my main criticism would be something like, for example, with in the article he says that we should teach the 3 R's, which I actually had to look up. I think it's writing, reading, and arithmetic.
Writing, arithmetic. Yeah, it's a joke.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I thought, well, the things that are really important to learn, people will learn because they are they are important. There's a benefit to learning them. So,
sure.
For example, a previous speaker, David Friedman, had a personal example in which his son had learned how to spell because he was playing video games, and he did not want to be embarrassed if he communicated with the other players in the chat, and had misspellings. So and I think that is the kind of thing that I find relatively persuasive. It's like, yes, the things that are important to learn, people will naturally want to learn because there is some benefit to them. And I'm wondering, what would the reply to that be?
No, I completely agree, and I think that's a very powerful way of learning. And I mean, the people, my students, and all sorts of people I work with, will be bored to tears when with the phrase, "To what problem is that a solution?" I mean, it's kind of, I use it like some people use salt, you know. But it's, for me, that was the single most transformative idea for me as a school teacher, and then as a university teacher. To what problem is this a solution? And the whole body of work I've done since then in pedagogy, I was a professor of pedagogy, is based on that idea. I would simply just say individual learning, if we look at research in learning, is actually one of the least effective ways. But in certain situations, like the one you gave, it's very effective. But if we're trying to teach children whatever skill, let's say to read, we have to remember the key fact, which is, to what problem is reading a solution? If they don't need to read, then this is a redundant skill. I sometimes say, you know, it's like saying to somebody, "Don't pick your nose." And they say, "Well, I wasn't picking my nose." No, it's just general advice. Well, that's kind of the basic model of teaching, isn't it? Just tell people loads of stuff. Well, unless that stuff makes sense to the student, and unless they're able to relate it to some meaningful problems in their lives, then learning either will be very, very inefficient or not take place at all. My point with regard to pedagogy is not that we don't respect that, because we absolutely have to. It's just that we should not be limited by that. If we're trying to teach skills in which we can create a context in which learning happens in the way you described, that's fabulous. If we can't, we have to recognize that we're still dealing with active problem-solving learners. And therefore, for example, even if you're teaching a room of 500 people in an auditorium, it's still possible to phrase your teaching in a way that is problem-based. For example, by talking about common myths, common errors, misunderstandings. Immediately, if you do it effectively, people are thinking, well, what is the answer then? You've actually got that kind of that inquisitiveness that's the heart of learning. The traditional lecture model, of course, is I assume you're a tabula rasa and I just tell you lots of stuff on the assumption either that you're, empty bucket, as Popper said, or something might stick. I mean, that's a profoundly ignorant, but also anachronistic model of education. So when I say pedagogy and, if you like, the logic of learning, to use Burgess and Swan's phrase, and the logic of pedagogy are conceptually distinct, but it does not mean that that's a justification for dogma. It just means that if there are things that children have to learn, I kind of think Popper's not right. I probably agree with you, but if there are, we have to still teach it in a problem-based way.
Right. So you think that there is the possibility of kind of a hybrid approach, maybe, that where you, it's not that you're letting students be completely free in your model, but the way that you're teaching them is by taking into account that you can't just tell them stuff and have them absorb it and make it part of their understanding of the world. You have to actually, like, as you said, maybe you can give a lecture by using common myths or something as an example of where people go wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I wouldn't use compromise. I'd use the word nuanced, because education is characterized by a pendulum, right? Ultra traditional, ultra progressive, ultra traditional. Neither of those is an intelligent educational strategy. There's something about education that means we simply cannot, or we find it very difficult to adopt a nuanced position. So, I mean, for example, the traditional progressive pedagogy variable is actually not very accurate in the history of education, because at the very least, there's a third prong, radical. A.S. Neil Summerhill would be a radical education. I wrote a book called Summerhill a couple of years ago. No one, well, I'll correct myself afterwards, no one would suggest that was progressive education. But of course they would suggest it. And in fact, Popperians use Summerhill as an example of a progressive school. This is a teacher who I admire in many ways, who says things like, I have no interest in how children learn. I have no interest if they're in the room. If they make mistakes, I humiliate them into learning. That is not a progressive thing. But you will find books on Popper education that give Summerhill as the paradigm case of a progressive education. It's more to do with clan or gang mentality than it is to do with kind of educational philosophy. Maybe it's because it's to do with our kids or something like that. I don't know. But I think there's a nuanced position which says these are conceptually distinctive ideas, and the pedagogy, the efficient pedagogy of the teacher or the coach, because I can see a friend of mine who's a coach down in the corner, is to recognize that these are actual individuals we're teaching. Even in a room full of people, it's a room full of individuals with desires and interests, and most importantly, problems to be addressed. And there are ways of doing that that do not mean either breaking up into individual tutorials or just telling them stuff.
Yes, that kind of brings me on to my next question, which is, I'm very curious how you would go about making a curriculum for the more nuanced kind of model that you're proposing. Because I think there is something weird about having a curriculum if you also think that people have their own problem situation. Because I think in practice, very often, teachers will kind of try to lure people into being interested in the curriculum, but there's always this kind of motivation in the back of their mind that they should be like motivating the student. And if persuasion doesn't work, then they just have to use harsher methods.
Yeah,
and
sure.
So I think that the curriculum poses maybe some problems for the way you're thinking about this.
Yes, I agree. I mean, the continent, which I guess is where you're from,
Yes.
has a much more sophisticated understanding of the curriculum called didactic, and that is essentially a kind of science of education. That concept doesn't exist in the US or the UK. In fact, didactic is essentially a term of abuse in the UK and America. It means just telling them to do stuff. Yeah, you're right. I mean, curriculum is a really interesting problem because, I mean, many countries now in Europe have a national curriculum. And if you trace the history of those curriculum, they are virtually indistinguishable from curricula 100 years ago. Now, that could either be that they've somehow stumbled across historical truth, or education is a rather reactionary enterprise in which people talk about essentially what they know and what they've experienced themselves. So when in UK 1992 curriculum was introduced for the first time, it was essentially the same as the grammar school and independent school curriculum of 1902. It's not a coincidence that the ministers of the government who came up with that curriculum, all 100% of them went to grammar schools or independent schools. So essentially it's a reactionary type thing. I mean, I'm a fan of the concept of minimal competence. I think at certain stages, let's say the end of primary school and the end of secondary school, there are certain minimum competencies that we as a society believe are necessary to achieve. And the curriculum is our vehicle for doing that. But the space or the scope for individual inquiry must be vastly greater than it is now. Now, interestingly, Wittgenstein did employ precisely that method when he taught. It was all project-based and things like this. Now, the problem with project-based teaching is, generally speaking, it's not very effective, but that's probably because it's difficult and you have to train people to do it. Popper used problem-based teaching as well, and he wasn't a fan, but I think that's probably more to do with his psychology than pedagogy, because he was kind of an authoritarian type of personality as a teacher. But no, I agree. I think if you had a skeleton curriculum primarily determined by minimal competency outcomes, and then there is assessment at those points, and if students are struggling, then they get remedial support and things like this. And if the pedagogy is focused on like the didactics model for continental Europe, where essentially you're training people to be craftsmen of the curriculum, you're crafting the experiences, and then the curriculum is nothing more than the experiences that the students experience, that students come across. If it's a capital C curriculum, like in Europe, you're essentially giving people solutions to problems they do not have. And that seems to be profoundly problematic. Not the least, we know it doesn't work. We know that, just look at it, it does not work. You know, we have massive dropout of education at the first point of the end of formal education. We have very low levels of literacy and numeracy, particularly in the United States, but across Europe as well. The measures of educational outcome strongly correlate with social class and parental income, which suggests to me that's not a very good model, because essentially what it means is you're simply reproducing the advantage that your parents offered you, whereas the people who need education the most are left floundering. So no, I think you're probably right. I just think that because we haven't looked at it seriously, we need to do a hell of a lot more thinking and research to actually do it with a level of skill, with a level of craft that's required.
Right. So in a way, you're saying that being too stringent with the curriculum, taking it too seriously is a problem, and being too sophisticated about it, like we are in Europe, where we like the whole aim of the education system is just to instill the national curriculum. That is a problem. And you also said that there are other approaches which seem to be possible, but which are inefficient and don't work quite well, such as the project-based way of learning. I think I actually kind of agree with that in a formal setting. Like I think that if you were to teach people, say, about a topic, or if you let them explore a topic of their interest and then present a project on it, or a paper, or a presentation or something, I think one way that will be inefficient is that the people that the presentation will be for, namely the other students or the teachers or something, I think there are certain things which are of value to me, which are not of value to other people. And other people, if I present the ideas to them, then they would miss the point. They would, like, not everyone finds Popper interesting, and you might give a presentation to an uninterested audience about Popper. I think that
it depends what you're trying to learn, doesn't it? I mean, first of all, if you look at the research into interest, personal interest, what we find is that the opening the door happens when somebody is stimulated by a book or something somebody said and things like that. That can be short-lived because it's often depending on the quality of the book or the teacher and things like this. When they get into an activity, then the interest shifts from the, if you like, the stimulus to something more to do with personal meaning and things like that. So it takes time. And one of the duties, it seems to me, of education is what the legal scholar Joel Feinberg calls the child's right to an open future. And I think if that's what he means by that is that during childhood, parents make decisions on behalf of the child, not as parents, but as a proxy for the child. So that when the child is old enough to make decisions for themselves, they would be in broad agreement with those decisions. And essentially what that means, I think, is you keep at every stage, you try and keep options open. And that means not shutting doors. So if we're trying to teach children to have an open future, the minimum we have to offer is a diverse, varied curriculum. If you're giving a presentation about a topic somebody is not interested in, well, so what? Because 90% of the school curriculum the kids are not interested in, that's kind of a fair, I'm willing to accept that compromise. But what we're trying to teach those children who are not interested in Popper, let's say, might not be Popper, but it might be tolerance, it might be questioning, it might be critical engagement, it might be weighing up an argument. And while they're developing those skills, they're also being introduced to Popper, or they're also being introduced to something else. So I think it's perfectly acceptable that children sit through presentations of something they're not interested in. I mean, I also think, by the way, you know, my grand old age, I've kind of come to the conclusion that literally nothing is boring. There is no boring subject. It's entirely a matter of the way you approach that subject and your openness to it. When I was an undergraduate, I'd studied neuroscience. I understood none of it. And I had a professor who, when the group of us said, none of us understand this lecture, his solution, how's this for pedagogy, was, I will speak faster and you'll be forced to understand. Brilliant. Now, I work in neuroscience now. I love it. And the reason was that my professional life has developed such that all of a sudden neuroscience offers me solutions to genuine problems to do with pedagogy. I'm really glad I was forced to sit through those boring lectures. I really was. I was really glad because it gave me at least some conceptual framework to begin my later exploration. So yeah, I think it's okay. I mean, what's wrong with boredom? I don't know, but it's perfectly reasonable. We don't have enough boredom in the world. We have to keep entertaining people all the time. Everyone has to be happy and engaged. Well, this is the first time in human history where that's been an imperative. So, I mean, I shift my position. I'm now in favour of boredom. I think we should tell people stuff they're not interested in because you need to learn that skill. But no, I think it's, I think, you know, there is no efficient model because we're teaching human beings and they're weird and idiosyncratic. But you've got to get along with people. So school is where you learn those skills.
Yeah, since you mentioned that we live in an unusual age, I was also wondering, what do you think about, for example, YouTube as an educational, or like YouTube and other websites as educational resources? Because some of the problems that you just mentioned, I think, are solved by things like the Khan Academy. I don't know if that's known to everyone, but Khan Academy is this website which basically has free lectures for high school students about mathematics, physics, and a whole range of other topics. And in fact, it was the way I learned mathematics, because in my high school, I didn't quite listen to the lectures, and there wasn't a maths book, there was no textbook. So I mostly learned from Khan Academy. And I was just wondering what you think about that as a solution to some of the things you mentioned. And then it will also be a solution to boredom, I think, because people have more choice.
This is one of the areas I'm working on at the moment, exactly that. And I think I completely agree. I mean, I don't know if you've read Ivan Illich, Deschooling Society. If not, I think it has a lot of parallels with Popper. And Illich was somebody who famously, his first book was about the tyranny of the medical profession, and then his second big book was about the tyranny of school. And his idea, and in the 1960s, there are a few books, Schools Without Walls and Compulsory Miseducation. And I think if we genuinely do have this conception of education in which individuals are trying to follow their own path and things like this, that either things like YouTube or the Khan Academy become part of the pedagogic suite of teachers and schools, not to control them, but to use them as resources. Because of course, in the Popperian model, the teacher is a resource, like YouTube is a resource in that sense, providing information, but none of it with any authority. The alternative is they literally just follow YouTube. And what happens there? Well, we know what happens there. They decide, because of a couple of YouTube clips, that the coronavirus is a hoax, that MMR vaccine causes autism, and 101 other ridiculous ideas, because they haven't got the understanding of the basic concepts. If it was included within a, let's say, school without walls, so the teacher becomes this kind of, let's say, crafts person who kind of directs and guides education. But you look at this amazing information we have available on YouTube, the Khan Academy. At the moment, I'm doing 3 courses on Udemy and 1 on FutureLearn, which are brilliant resources. And they're at least as good as your average university lecture, at least as good as. To make the most of it, I think you need, let's say, a mentor, for want of another word, who can just talk you through it. And I think that is quite an important role of the teacher. So people like Illich and I think it's Elliot Reimer, School Without Walls, I think offer a vision of schooling with which Popper would be quite comfortable when he was in his progressive mood. When he's in his more dogmatic mood, I suspect it's more of a kind of a traditional, at least for children, more traditional teaching. But actually, I think it dovetails quite closely with some of the things we're talking about, I think.
Right. I think when you mention that people learn certain things that are false on YouTube, one of my responses was, well, people are going to do that regardless, I think, because I think YouTube is a much used platform. And we can't really control what people learn anyway. Like even within school, the way that teachers in traditional schools try to force students to learn certain things. They try to get the curriculum across, but they don't have any control over what they learn outside of school. And I imagine that, I think usually people, when they engage with these kinds of false ideas, they become critical to some extent. Like, for example, they might question something about coronavirus. They might do so wrongly. They might be wrong in their criticism, but it is a kind of critical attitude that's developing in people. And
is it though? I think there's different types of critical attitude, and I think dismissing out of ignorance isn't usefully called criticism.
Well, it depends on the people in question, I think, because it depends on the way that people engage with the topic. It depends on what kind of information they're using, and it's often a way in which like kind of conversations get started. Like you might have a controversial opinion.
I totally agree. This is something I'm working on literally at the moment. In fact, 2 days' time, I'm doing a seminar on the demarcation problem, obviously inspired by Popper. My empirical research is to do with beliefs in pseudoscientific views of learning. And it's a problem because teachers, when we've studied school teachers in Holland, for example, 94% of teachers believe things that have been empirically falsified, like learning styles or left brain, right brain, or brain gym, this nonsense thing that goes around Europe. 90% of English teachers, UK teachers do this. 70% of Chinese teachers. There's a real, so the question is, what do we do about it? Well, one solution, the obvious solution, is you teach people about it. The problem with that is that it makes them more vulnerable to bad ideas. So if you offer a short course on neuroscience, people become more vulnerable to neuromyths. And it's almost like the embodiment of a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. You got a few ideas, but not enough talk about it. The only thing that seems to work is teaching them about epistemology, teaching them about knowledge and fallibilism and what the scientific method might look like, if such a thing exists, and certainly what the scientific attitude looks like. That seems to work quite well. Now, I would say, you know, like Popper says, we said earlier on about dogmatism. Obviously, in some of his work, he disagreed with Berkeley about the extent to which belief in reason and criticism are held. And he used the word faith, but I think we could use the word dogmatism again there in an educational setting. And he would say, well, you've just got to tell people about, you know, knowledge is difficult and slippery. And if you hold something completely to be true, you'll almost certainly be wrong. And all these, and once you get that, then people start approaching things like YouTube or the 101 other forums with a critical attitude, with a recognition that no source has authority. Even the most trusted sources are probably wrong over time, or at least not completely correct. Simple questions like, so where's the evidence? How can I falsify that? In what circumstances might this be shown to be wrong? And if you teach that to children and university graduates, that seems to offer some degree of immunization against pseudoscience, Pseudowissenschaft, as they say in Germany.
Yeah, that kind of, I think that makes sense. I think what you want is to have a critical discussion that's going on. I mean, when you said that the teachers have all these misconceptions, that must mean that teachers are not really discussing any of these topics among themselves, or that they must totally have these ideas and no one ever really questions them. Yep. I wonder to what extent they influence their method of teaching. But either way, it's weird. That's another thing I always kind of find weird about schooling from a Popperian point of view. It's how do we correct the errors in the ways that people think about teaching? How do we correct the errors in the curriculum? And like, where are the critical discussions? Because again, I think Popper would say something like, well, the critical discussions are not really supposed to be part of that level of education. As you said, it should be part of...
But he can be. I mean, I taught secondary school PE, physical education, and then I taught what's called reception, so kindergarten. I had critical conversations with 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds. I remember one, give an example, we were doing dinosaurs. So my question for them for the weekend was, what color were the dinosaurs? And I'll be honest with you, I saw that on some television program, and then I realized I had literally never thought of this question. And the kids went home, came back to school, and we had a really interesting conversation about the nature of evidence of dinosaurs and the fact that we really actually don't know what color the dinosaurs were because we just have the bones. And they were 4. And the mistake that people like, say, Anthony O'Hare wrote a book about education, and he's written about Popper, and he said, in order to have a democratic society, you have to kind of educate people, you have to, let's use the word, indoctrinate people into democracy. Now, I would say democracy is a doing word. Democracy is essentially a verb. You do democracy. And if you have non-democratic ways of teaching and learning, you're immediately undermining the purpose of the enterprise. Whereas if your conversations, for example, as a teacher, the magic word, I do not know, opens up massive opportunities for children's learning. Well, let's find out. How can we find out? How will we know it's reliable? And I just think as soon as a child can speak, you can have that type of conversation. And then it becomes more sophisticated, but not much more sophisticated. I mean, David Miller wrote a wonderful dismissive article against critical thinking textbooks. where they teach you, way up arguments. I mean, it really destroyed them, I think, because they're implying there's this kind of special method. Well, it isn't. I mean, critical thinking is more accurately described, I think, as kind of an attitude characterized by a respect for truth and an awareness of our limitations. And if you've got that, if we can inculcate that through education, all the stuff we're talking about, different forms of knowledge, suddenly become viable for us, I think. And also I'd say an intolerance of bullshit. And I think if Popper was right now, he'd be talking about that, because the kind of wave of bullshit that goes through society, but also schools, is really quite alarming. And if you don't have discussions, or what nowadays we would call communities of practice, where teachers come together and do exactly what you've described, but that's quite rare. And it should be the norm, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you. Something like that should be the norm, where people have, like, they engage with each other about the ideas that they have regarding education.
Totally.
And yeah, I think that, okay, so we're roughly at the point where we're going to open up the floor for the Q&A.
Right.
And there were some questions in the chat which I thought would be nice to open with. So David Deutsch had a question, which he had some skeptical questions saying, I noticed that the different number of people coming to the Popper Society, I noticed that there's a different number of people coming to the Popper Society every week. Should we force the rest to come, bored or not? And he added, perhaps boredom isn't inherently bad, but is coercion inherently bad? If not, whom? By which I think he means, like, who can and can you not coerce?
Well, I mean, a lot of it goes down, settles on what you mean by coercion. If you mean the imposition of certain expectations, then all of us are vulnerable or there. But I do think, I mean, if we mean by coercion kind of something like, obviously physical force would be one, but I would also say indoctrination would be another form of coercion, then I think they're indefensible because they're inconsistent with the values of an open society. I think that things like boredom, I mean, obviously, just for context, it was slightly provocative saying that we should try and encourage boredom, obviously, but I do think that this kind of obsession with pleasure and happiness and the positive industry has done as much harm as the kind of draconian education that we were talking about, where everything has to be happy, everyone has to have prizes. If you go to university, you do the student survey, and essentially it's a popularity contest for your lecturers and all things like that. No, I think if you offer something interesting, if you offer something that offers solutions to problems that are real to people, or at the least are presented in a way where people think there may be something here that offers a solution that's real to me, then I think, if you build it, they will come. There we go.
I think, again, I agree with it. When you say, I think I had a misconception of what you meant with the, how did you just call it just now? The happiness industry or something like that. Yeah. So I think I had a misconception about that because I didn't realize you meant, say, the prizes or the popularity contests or things like that. But those seem to be, for example, prizes are kind of an integral part of education. Like, I think people view their grades as a kind of prize that they get for studying. And
it's inversely related to intrinsic motivation. The more we reward, the more we give people prizes, the more we give external gratification for doing something that should be intrinsically motivating, we harm motivation.
Yeah, that's very nice, because I basically 100% agree with that. And it's interesting because I would say that undermines the whole enterprise, because you can't, the schools just have as an integral part to them the external motivation structures. It's you get grades, you get bad grades if you do badly, and people are angry at you if you don't pay attention, if you don't engage.
This is one of the problems with education. Everyone thinks they know, and therefore it kind of ends up as this kind of slightly unpleasant, commonsensical thing. I'll give you a specific example. Praise. There are, generally speaking, praise is viewed to be an unconditional good. The more you praise, you're like to build up people's self-esteem. You should never criticize because it damages the self-esteem. None of that is true. None of it's true. Empty praise damages children's self-esteem because that develops through, self-esteem develops through a trusting relationship with someone you admire who gives you their time, who thinks you're worth talking to. If you give them all this empty praise, I mean, one model, if you have to criticize somebody, this is a good one for Popper, if you have to criticize somebody, give them 5 pieces of positive information first. Now, not a scrap of evidence supports that idea, but all of the evidence shows simply saying nice things is picked up by the children as, why is this man lying to me? Why is this woman lying to me? Because try it yourself. Give 5 pieces of positive feedback to your best friend or your mum. By around number 3 or 4, you're simply making it up because that is just not that much to say. Whereas if you are honest and give honest feedback, honest criticism, you build up trust, you build up a relationship, you build up self-esteem. I use the phrase, criticism is an act of love. If I care enough about you to read your work or watch your performance and give you an honest feedback, I have given you my love. So the whole happiness thing is kind of upside down, it seems to me. But where does it come from? Because it's kind of intuitively plausible. Well, that's not a good enough reason.
I think my response to what you just said would be something like, criticism is extremely useful when you receive it at the right time. So if you, like, I'm currently writing a paper, and I look forward to receiving criticism on that paper when it is ready for the criticism. But if someone were to read it right now and then give me unwanted feedback, it might actually greatly disturb my writing process, and it might put me off from continuing writing it.
And this is what we were saying, that problems and solutions. If I give you feedback on something that you don't want feedback on, I'm giving you solutions to something that is not a problem. The evidence on this is fairly clear. This is probably the area of research in educational science, mainly in the Netherlands, which is most clear. What type of feedback is most effective? After the completion of the task, which is what you said, definitely not during the task, after the completion of the task, as soon after the task as possible, and as focused as possible. Now, in fact, that's not always the way feedback is given, is it? It often is during the process. It's often a long time after it's finished, and then it's rather general. But the evidence on feedback, if you want to, for example, to improve sports performance, you wait till they finish the task, you give them as soon as possible thereafter, and you're as precise, specific as possible. Oh, and you only focus on the goal. You make no reference to the individual. This is probably the most robust finding from learning sciences.
Yes.
Might be wrong, of course.
So do you think that there could be such a thing as a science of education, or a science of human understanding and learning?
Yeah, there has to be. That has to be our goal. I think, you know, this, I think, as I say, the role of a teacher as a craftsperson, I think when people say teaching is an art, I literally have no idea what that means. But there are scientific principles like feedback that should be universally maintained by teachers. I think things like discussion, criticism, and things like this, problem solving, should be taught by teachers. Because otherwise, where does it come from? It comes from, you know, observing other teachers. Main place it comes from is the teacher's own schooling. That's the main determinant of teachers' practice. Well, you know, children of the future, George Benson told us. That's not a good enough reason just to say we've always done it that way. So absolutely. So I'm really in favour of a movement towards the continental model of education, or teacher education, which is didactic, which is a subject called education science. That doesn't exist in the UK, doesn't exist in America, Australia, and so on.
And my impression of those subjects is that they are almost necessarily historicists, in that they haven't, so I once participated in a university course about didactics, and I think what I realized in hindsight reading Popper was that they have a conception about how people develop through different stages of their lives and what they need to learn at different stages of their lives. And I think that that is fairly historicist in the sense that they have a conception about the growth of knowledge in an individual. They have ideas about how someone learns, and I think that in that sense, like, it's not. I mean, I imagine you mean something differently.
I do mean something
else.
different, but
yeah.
That is a good point. I mean, yeah, how can you put it? I mean, there's different didactics, right? In the same way as there's different philosophy and different whatever. But all I mean by didactics is a unified scientific discipline. Now, European didactics, as you'll know, essentially is based upon the philosophy and psychology of Herbart, which is like 150 years old. And essentially that is inductivist, associationist, and also profoundly class-ridden. I mean, Herbart said, and Herbart is a German philosopher and psychologist of like late 1800s, something like that. He said, the education of the working class should be preparation for the field. The education of the middle class should be preparation for the office, and the education of the upper class should be education for leadership. Well, nobody would suggest that's the case. Well, you know, your current prime minister might, but apart from him, so I obviously don't mean that. What I mean is, if we look at the UK, for example, you look at Oxford University Department of Education Studies. There's history of education, philosophy of education, psychology of education, economics of education, and something happens, or is supposed to happen. They kind of come together, and then a teacher pops out the end. Whereas the continental model, there's a unified framework of what is required to be a teacher. That's all I mean by that.
Right. We have some more questions in the chat I just saw. One of them was, do you think that the sort of Khan Academy can replace some bad teachers?
Oh, thank God, that's an easy, yes. Yeah, I think the good thing about the Khan Academy is the quality of the work. It's really well thought out. So yeah, I think it is eminently suitable to, should we say, to remediate bad teachers.
Do you think that it is possible to, I think you alluded to this before, but is it possible to incorporate Khan Academy in schools without changing the school system?
Yeah, you can. There's no reason why. I mean, the English curriculum is quite restrictive, not too much. Most countries, France is even more restrictive, but most countries aren't. We're doing work at the moment, one project with a lot of disabled people who work with disabled people, another project we're working with teachers in Bangladesh. And in both cases, we're integrating materials like that in the scheme. And using this thing called blended learning, so some face-to-face and then personal inquiry and things like that, and it works quite well.
Nice. Kind of an unrelated question. How do you think that we should go about teaching controversies? Like, because there's certain topics within the scientific community that are controversial, not because they're political, but because there is just an unsolved problem. And there are various takes on it. So
it's a really interesting question. And if I'm honest, I don't have a really strong view on that as an issue. But what I do think is, if you have a model of science education, for example, that is fact-based and taken on trust, but the teacher just tells the kids things, then I understand why some children aren't persuaded. Because it's just simply, if what a teacher, like, for example, you may know in certain religious places, they treat their religious teachers as another teacher. And if a religious teacher says the world was created in 5 days or whatever, 7 days, and then another teacher says, how are they to judge? again, what evidence suggests and what I think we could work out for ourselves is if you teach students and children the history of science, one thing comes across quite dramatically. People make mistakes, right? So this idea of progression and the idea, for example, that the most supported theory in the history of science is probably Newtonian mechanics. And so obviously that must be right, because there's never been a theory that's had so much verification. And then obviously Einstein and Bohr and people like that come along. So I think if you teach the history of science as a really core part of science, you don't have to say to students, of course we all make mistakes. It's all about testing. It's all about incorporating earlier theories, but offering more, because that's picked up by the history of science. It's kind of, this is what Agassi does really well in some of his books, like the book Science in Flux. These case studies just demonstrate the nature of science. And I think if you have a background like that, you're actually fairly well prepared to judge, let's say, evolution versus creationism, because you can actually look at the, should we say, the biography of those ideas. So I think that's the way to do it. With regard to, in the philosophy of education, teaching of controversial issues is quite a big issue. I think it's really interesting, but I haven't thought about it enough to say anything sensible. So,
yeah, my impression of is that people often want to kind of, go outside of the curriculum. They want to, well, there are some teachers at least who like going outside of the curriculum. And I think they experience a great deal of resistance from the schooling system, because of course, every way in which we measure how schools perform is based on things that are at least somewhat tangible to people who don't know the students in question. So they can see, oh, well, these people are getting high grades. And we have independent ways of testing that the exams are well made or something. And then if you try to teach them about the history of science, it's really difficult, because no one outside of probably outside of the teacher for that specific course will really understand what the people have learned. Maybe even the lecturer won't understand it, because he doesn't get what impression he made on the minds in the classroom. And it comes down to a question of, how do we test genuine knowledge? Because we can test that people have learned to, for example, do exams well, and that is different from what you just described, this understanding of the history of science and of fallibilism. And how do we...
It's a really good question. I mean, I think the key, effective assessment is valid assessment, right? So in most jobs, a written examination is not a valid assessment, because it does not assess the qualities and skills and the knowledge and the values that are necessary for those jobs. So the one way is actually kind of the Oxbridge model, which is happening more and more now with universities doing your own assessment. We know what type of people we want, so we will administer our own assessment. I mean, the kind of formalized assessment model, it makes sense kind of politically. I mean, the real reason, well, one of the reasons we really push formal assessment is nothing to do with careers or jobs. It's to do with international comparison league tables, right? So when countries like the UK perform badly in mathematics in the OECD PISA rankings, something must be done, But if you're getting a job, let's say working in an office, compared to, let's say, a swimming teacher, you've got a different suite of skills that you need. And it would seem to me that the people that work in the office and the people that work at the swimming pool have a much better understanding about the knowledge, skills, values, and understandings, knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values than the teachers do. So I think if you have this kind of broad skeleton framework for knowledge and you let people inquire, follow their interests, the one thing they probably would bring to the interview is this kind of inquisitive attitude. Then we look to ICI, the Confederation of British Industries, and what are the skills that they want from their new employees? critical thinking, inquisitiveness, independent inquiry, exactly the type of skills that we've just been talking about. And in fact, according to the Confederation of British Industry, they will always choose so-called soft skills like research and inquiry skills over academic skills. So I think this kind of thing about assessment, whilst I understand the politics of it, is overblown, because even if the exams ended tomorrow, it wouldn't affect employers. They would just work out their own assessment, and it would likely be much more valid. An assessment that's not valid is essentially kind of bordering on unethical. You're making people invest huge amounts of time, often money, into an education system that is assessed with an invalid method. That seems to be really problematic. So yeah.
Yes. So again, you have criticisms of the usual education system, the traditional education system, and you think that these criticisms are valid, but we can incorporate them into a more nuanced understanding of education and of
I mean, the problem with, you've got someone like Durkheim, the sociologist, who said, education is a permanent tension between innovation and resistance. And I think that's exactly it. And when I talk to, so in my book on ASNIL, I went to somebody who did all my research. Never in a million years do I think that would become kind of roll out nationally, because on the one hand, many parents have been enculturated into the traditional model, but on the other hand, it would never be allowed to happen. So I guess I'm persuaded more by the people that say we should nudge towards liberty, because I've worked enough with various government agencies to know quite how massively powerful they are. And how certainly in countries like Europe and the UK and things like that, we have to learn to compromise. I think there are better and worse ways of doing things, but the big problem with postmodernism is, if you look at the literature on it, it refuses to compromise for good reason, because it's driven by ethics. That's completely on board. But if we're talking about the art of the possible, we have to have this conception of our goal, but recognize we have to get there somehow, and we're not going to do it in a few short jumps. And if we're trying to benefit the education of all students, we have to think of a system an approach that will affect the whole system. So it's compromising, nuance, depends what word you like.
Right. I think, that makes, I think I'm understanding like your way of viewing the improvements and how to adjust. And it's quite nice, because it's, again, as we said at the beginning of the conversation, most Popperians, I think, jump to progressivism like myself, but it's nice to see a model of education in which some of the criticisms can be addressed while still retaining the more traditional components of it. I think it's interesting.
It's uncomfortable, because almost everyone is in some sort of gang, and gangs are what's causing us the problem in education, it seems to me. Are you a traditional gang? Are you a positive gang? Are you a radical gang? That's to do with your identity. That is completely independent upon the needs of children or young people or whatever.
I had another question in mind, but it just slipped away. I see a question in the chat. Recommend good books on education which are purely scientific and least biased in explaining education. How to provide education and what should be provided as education. I think that's kind of the basic gist of the question. I can expand if it's necessary.
I mean, with regard to how to provide, or the goals of education, obviously that's value based. And this is another problem. Alice in Wonderland, walking through the forest, and she sees Humpty Dumpty on the tree, and she says, "Can you tell me which way to go?" And Humpty Dumpty says, "Well, where do you want to end up?" And she says, "Well, I don't mind where I end up." And so Humpty Dumpty says, "It doesn't matter which way you go then." And one of the problems with education is we haven't got this real clear conception. But within evidence-based, the standard reference for evidence-based education is John Hattie Visible Learning. And that's just, it has its weaknesses. It's entirely meta-analysis. The whole thing is statistical analysis of evidence. So if numbers are your thing, that's the book for you. If you want something that's a bit kind of evidence and more readable, I would say look at Jerome Bruner, who was an American psychologist at Harvard, Bruner. And his books are, on the one hand, beautifully written, and on the other hand, slightly out of date, but really provocative image of education. So I think Jerome Bruner is very good. And then there's a wonderful book from the American Academy of Sciences called How People Learn. And everything about that book says to me, it must be awful, but somehow it's brilliant. It's really, really good. Never mentions Popper, but I challenge you to read one chapter and not see the connection. It's really fascinating. If you look at the evidence for, again, it's a little bit out of date now, but we haven't made that much advance. If you look at the way they present how people learn, it's very, very interesting for Popperians. Very interesting, I think. So I would say those three books. Visible Learning, from Bruner, The Culture of Education, and How People Learn, I would say. And A.S. Neal and Summerhill by Bailey, and The Open Society and Its Enemies by Bailey. Those last two are better than Shakespeare.
Very nice. Yeah, I'm curious how, what did you like about, you said how learning works, or how people learn?
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, because, you know, if you look at research into what teachers and parents think happens with learning, this phone is drumming around, for want of a better phrase, it's an empty bucket, right? They've got intuitively what's called folk psychology is you just tell people stuff and it fills up the bucket of knowledge, and that's what's being educated. Well, everything we know about how people learn says that's not true. We're active explorers, Popper says searchlight, drawing information from our environment. So even if you've got a teacher didactically in the English sense, just telling you stuff, the learners are still taking bits of information to create their schema, for want of a better word. This book starts from the premise that learners turn up to school already knowledgeable, which is something I talk a lot of as well. I talk about learner biographies. There is no subject I can imagine, I'm happy to be corrected, where we know nothing. So for example, if I'm teaching somebody badminton, if they come to badminton, if it's a private club, there's a reason they're there. They've got some presupposition about what it'll be like. They've got some idea about sport, about training, about health. If we ignore that, we teach at their peril, because we're ignoring, and of course they may have extraordinary knowledge. And this to me is an inherently Popperian idea, that they have, when they turn up, they have this host of problems needing solutions. And the traditional model is, I will give you the solution and then you get the problem. And the how people learn begins from individuals approach a learning environment with their host of interests and ideas and problems and whatever. That if we could learn to do that universally, what a massive improvement education would experience. Not just talking to people, not just keep telling them stuff, but actually recognizing that there's a little universe in each of these children, and they've got, that universe has its own history and biography and all these type of things. And therefore, for a very practical point, before you teach anyone anything, either talk to them or observe them doing that thing. Because how do you know what to teach? How do you know when to teach? How do you know the level to teach? You don't. So talk to them or observe them and then teach. Traditional pedagogy, teach and assess. But no, Popper would say, no, he wouldn't, but I would say assess, then teach, then assess. Then teach, then assess for the rest of your life.
Yeah, that's a very nice idea. I mean, it's just true, I think, that we all have ideas about, we all have common sense ideas about how certain subjects, how sports, how physics, how chemistry work. I think that's also why your idea of starting with a myth starting with a common sense myth is very nice, because that's addressing the fact that we have these ideas about whatever it is we're engaging with at the moment.
I'll give you, I mean, there's another thing, if you don't address the myths, misunderstandings, if you don't teach the individual misunderstandings, there was a study in Harvard where they tested basic grade 1, so it's like 6-year-old physics. They tested the physics graduates at Harvard, and about 40% failed. And why is that? Because their myths and their misunderstandings were not addressed, and all this knowledge was piled on top of the myth. But when push comes to shove, of course, your foundations are flawed. Nobody bothered to say, I don't know, we all think that energy is produced in this way, but in fact, actually really talking about that. So it turns out, I mean, they performed as badly as first grade students, and they're Harvard students, which is nearly as good as Oxford students, I believe.
Yes, I think so too. I imagine that they have like a different problem situation though. So one of the things I learned when doing physics at a higher level is that actually, like, for one thing, we focus very little on classical mechanics, even though there's still people who research classical mechanics, which is fascinating. And also, these subjects tend to be much more complex than we give them credit for. Like, classical mechanics is actually, in some ways, much more difficult than quantum theory, I think.
Okay.
And partly that might be because I just don't engage with it, and it isn't fresh for me. But it's definitely interesting that people can walk around with myths about physics and not have them addressed.
I mentioned Bruno earlier on, and he had an approach to pedagogy that I use now when I offer these different programs called the spiral curriculum. And his idea was, this was, again, was for Harvard students, there is no idea so complicated that it can't be explained to a 5-year-old in its very basic form. So if that's true, what he did was he had this curriculum that had all these very basic ideas, and you just got progressively more complicated, not more complicated, more advanced and things like that. So what that means to me is that if I'm teaching people how to teach, I identify the real core skills, the skeleton, the minimum competence, and that's what spirals up. And then the rest of it is problem solving, individual inquiry, and things like that. But the great thing about the Brunerian model is it should stop that problem of basic misunderstanding from happening, because you keep returning to the same context, but in different ways. And the exquisite teacher, of course, can make every level new. The old poem, I return to that place, and it was as if I'd never been there. Well, that's what a teacher should do.
Yeah, that's a very nice way of putting it. It's incredibly true. Popper has some of this himself. He writes about the history of physics. I think it's in The Myth of the Framework, and as well as I imagine, I forget which other books, but he writes a bit about the history of physics. And for example, there's this problem of elasticity of objects, and it's a very subtle thing. There's this problem of an object can actually not be completely rigid, because if it were to be completely rigid, then it would take an infinite amount of force to actually get it to move. And that's in some sense, it's a very simple idea. And I remember reading that and thinking, okay, I've never actually thought about this, but this is a huge problem at the heart of kind of classical physics. Wow. And you had this sensation of, wow, this is actually a really fresh subject in some sense, because I haven't lived through the history of physics and the kinds of things that concern people in the past. I don't know about all of them, even though they've been solved. And the newer, like the most modern theories have usually taken care of the solution, but it's still nice to see how they do this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a bit like when Popper, if you remember in his autobiography, he said, was it when he was 7 or 9, he came across the idea of infinity, and it just kind of blew his mind. And I have this idea that kind of nudged him on the way to his philosophical, as I say, of course, he was a science and maths teacher before he was a philosopher. But on that, in that journey, I mean, something you said reminded me of, when he was asking me about when I met him about my PhD, and I said, well, I'm looking to do this and this and this, and he didn't say anything for a while, and then said, to what problem is that a solution? And I couldn't think of an answer. And he really got me thinking, like, oh God, I literally never thought, basically, why do I need to do this thing? Never occurred to me. And, the whole thing about, is it a moral thing? Is it a kind of a practical thing? I don't know. I think with things like that, if somebody asking that one question or presenting that one piece of information can just knock us into a whole different journey, can't they? And yeah, physics or infinity or whatever. It's but that's what a teacher should do. That well-placed thing. There's a metaphor that I use sometimes. Let's imagine I'm here and the lights go out, and I call a electrician, and the electrician comes in and just with a small hammer taps a wall, and all the lights come on again, and he gives me a bill for £1,000. And I said, this seems quite expensive. Can you give me a breakdown of the cost? And sure. And it's hitting with hammer £1, knowing where to hit £999. That's what a teacher does, right? It's not about just loads and loads and loads of information. It's about waiting and then asking that question. I mean, my area of education is sport, right? Physical education. And so one of my mates from boxing's in the swing, hi Ray. The best coaches, like in fact, Mr. Askew sitting there, don't talk all the time. They watch. And then when they're ready, they make that point. That's what I mean by craftsman. Anyway, any other questions?
I don't see anyone in the chat who has a question.
I'll ask one quick question.
Yeah.
So please correct me if I am misrepresenting your ideas, so you talked about asking to what problem is this a solution in the context of education. So it's important to know what problem you're trying to solve, and it's important to be engaged with students' problems or children's problems. But then you also made this comment in support of boredom. And that was counterintuitive to me, because the way I understand boredom is that if you're bored, it means that you are not engaged in problem solving. So a teacher is talking and it doesn't relate to any problems that you have.
Yeah. That's
so
a fair
I wonder why boredom would ever be a good thing.
Yeah, no, that's a good comment. I mean, obviously it was supposed to be kind of a slightly provocative thing, but yeah, that's a good one. I suppose what I meant by boredom was not, I believe, and I don't know if I have reason to believe, well, obviously we never have reason to believe anything, but it seems to me that there is no such thing as boredom. There's something like unmet needs, unmet interests and things. And if you're a teacher who's remotely good at your job, it becomes obvious that the children who are disengaged have become disengaged from what you're offering or from what the school is offering. They're not inherently disengaged unless they've had some horrendous trauma or something like that. I suppose really apart from all the rhetoric of going boredom's great, what I was really meaning was kind of moments of quiet, moments of stillness, not excitement, not just sitting and listening. The old Winnie the Pooh. I'm not sure if it is Winnie the Pooh, but sometimes I sit and think, and sometimes I just sit. And we don't give kids enough time to do that. So probably you're right. I take your point. I don't really mean boredom in the sense of this is pointless. It is just not kind of actively pursuing knowledge. Because if you imagine, after like 12 years of education, of continuously inquisitively hunting knowledge, we'd all be basket cases. You know what I mean? We'd all be like university professors, wouldn't we? Because you have to have those quiet moments. And I think I take your point. I really mean just not kind of not turning on the spotlight, if that's a better way. So thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, Lucy, go ahead.
I read that I think it was Dewey who wrote against gamification in education. So if you try to gamify everything, that's an alternative to learning about something that interests you. So if you're just sitting on your phone or with a book, superficially you might think the person is bored, but I think your point is, it's actually just you're quiet and there isn't excitement or I don't know, noise, because you're interested in what you're reading in.
There's a really wonderful book by Neil Postman, who was an American professor of, I don't know, some communication studies or something, Amusing Ourselves to Death. And his point was, well, the metaphor is Sesame Street, which I think most of us think is rather lovely. But what he describes is children in America going into kindergarten and crying because there's no huge yellow bird in the room. They've got this expectation of what education is, which is continually entertaining all the time, grabbing your interest. There's no quiet moment. And he said, and I found it completely persuasive, we are ruining children with that mindset. This idea that I call it edutainment. You know, I don't have to educate you. I don't have to educate you. I have to edutain you, if that's a word. And what I mean by that is, in the era of student surveys, in the era of grade your professor, all these things, I see all the time professors desperately, or lecturers, trying to have a positive thing. So what they do, for example, is don't give a low grade, because that's really going to screw up your assessment. This is the opposite of what education should be like. But sitting quietly fishing or playing poo sticks or anyone else, that's exactly what education should be like, it seems to me. And then when you do find something that grabs your interest, it's all the more powerful because you've had the opportunity to sit and reflect and kind of think, oh, okay, that's cool, I'm going for that. Otherwise, you're just simply taken by whatever flashing lights are presented in front of you. God, I sound such an old Tory, don't I? Sorry.
Yeah, I think you have a much broader view of what learning entails than most people have in general. Like there's a common sense view that learning happens when you're in a classroom and when you're sitting in front of a book, or it happens under specific circumstances, which are typically like when there is a teacher involved. And I think what you're saying is that it's much broader than that. Like when people are quietly reading a book, when they're fishing, when they're engaging in something fun and something relaxing, they are also engaging with learning. They're learning about something, and they're doing something useful to them that the education system currently is not valuing.
Yeah, look, Einstein came up with his general theory of relativity whilst having a dream in which he was sitting on the edge of a light beam or something like that. People have had inspirational moments whilst they're sitting under a tree, meditating. Buddha would obviously be an example there, but any of us, or by being on a boat. I have them when I'm in the bath. You know, I sit in the bath and, well, I'm not putting myself in the same category as Einstein and the Buddha, but I do have my version of great ideas. Or when you're doing running, or, you know, Professor of Education at Oxford, Richard Pring, is a marathon runner, because he finds that when he's running, he's kind of, well, you know, different strokes for different folks. If you're going to an inclusive education system, we have to have times for doing stuff like that. Otherwise, your education takes place outside school, which kind of seems a bit odd when we're paying taxes for school. So yeah, no, I mean, learning happens all the time. And Popper says, of course, you know, life is problem solving. This is a continuous process until you die. And on the surface, that sounds like a rather depressing idea, that for the rest of your life, you're going to be grappling with various different ideas. But I think it's incredibly exciting. the idea that we're going to be learning for the rest of our lives, on the one hand, I think it's exciting. On the other hand, it suggests to me that we've got to sort out something during childhood so that they're ready to learn for the rest of their lives. And if they're turned off or disengaged, then I think we're actually doing them a huge disservice.
Yeah, you're here. I think, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. We have some strong time constraints on our end. That means we can't continue the Zoom call. But Richard, thanks so much for joining us. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. And for those people who want to continue the discussion, there will be a Clubhouse call. And yeah, I invite everyone to please thank our speaker with I enjoy the clapping emoji. So there's a virtual thank you.
Thank you
and
very much.
I hope to see you all at the next event. Thank you, Richard.